I'm delighted today to share with you a research update and present some of the key findings from the recent international conference held by the Alzheimer's Association. So in July of this year, we had our largest international conference. It was held in Toronto. There was more than 19,000 people were joining us. So this is a collection of scientists from all over the globe coming together. More than 6,000 abstracts were submitted. An abstract is where scientists submit a summary of their findings, and then they present that in more detail at the conference. So this was a really important event that brings us all together. And I couldn't present all 6,400 of the study results, but have chosen some of the most impactful ideas that were presented to share with you all here today. So before we begin, I just want to establish a foundation. This is a common question that we get when we hold these conversations, is understanding really what is Alzheimer's disease. So Alzheimer's is the most common type of dementia, and dementia is a general term that describes a decline in mental abilities that interfere with your daily life. There are other types of dementia in addition to Alzheimer's disease, and these include vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, and frontotemporal dementia as some of the next most common. So there's three main topics I'd like to talk about today. And the first is, can Alzheimer's disease be prevented? The second is, how can we better diagnose dementia? And then the third will be some updates on what is new and how do we treat Alzheimer's disease. So let's jump in. So one of the most important presentations had to do with preventing dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So we learned in the recent Lancet report was updated a year ago, and I don't know if you've heard of this before, that up to almost half of the cases of dementia are potentially preventable. And so I've listed them here. These are the risk factors that so increase your risk of getting dementia in the future. Some of them occur in early life, like education. Some of them occur in late life, like the vision loss. But the majority of these potentially modifiable risk factors occur in midlife. So things like hearing loss, high cholesterol, depression, traumatic brain injury, diabetes, each of these things increases the risk of dementia in the future. And the idea is that if you could treat them, if you could treat the hearing loss, if you could lower cholesterol, if you could encourage people to be less socially isolated, that you could potentially prevent or delay the onset of dementia in almost half of the cases. So the results of a study called the US Pointer Study were presented. This is a really large initiative across multiple sites over a 2-year time. So this was to test the idea that if we can target some of these modifiable risk factors, could we prevent cognitive decline with aging? And so this study enrolled 2,111 people and into a randomized controlled trial. They were looking for older adults without dementia that were at high risk for dementia. So 60 to 79 years old, people that did not exercise regularly, maybe didn't have the best diet, weren't quite eating the recommended dose of these green leafy vegetables, for example. But in addition to those three things, they looked for additional risk. So people who were 70 plus years old, so the people that are older are at higher risk. African Americans, Native Americans, and Hispanic people are at a higher risk. people that have a family history of memory impairment, and those that have cardiovascular health risk factors. So this is really an at-risk population. And the reason it was important to do this is because when you're looking at a 2-year study, you need an enriched population where you might see some cognitive decline in the shorter amount of time. The study took place all across the country, representing north, south, east, west, in the middle, Texas, Illinois, Rhode Island, California, North Carolina. So what they did is they randomized the participants. This means they randomly assigned people, kind of like the flip of a coin, to 2 different groups for the intervention. The first was a self-guided group, and the second was a structured group. The intervention itself was a combination of physical exercise, counseling and nutrition, cognitive and social activities, and health monitoring. So the self-guided team was encouraged to make changes that fit with their lifestyle. They had 6 meetings with peers over the 2 years. And opposed to that, the structure group, this was a much more intensive intervention. They had 38 facilitated peer team meetings, and they were given discrete goals and prescription, let's say lifestyle prescription in each of these areas. And they received direct coaching on how they might overcome barriers to incorporating some of these changes into their life. Now, you might be wondering if you're familiar with randomized controlled trials. Typically, there's a control group or placebo group. And in a drug trial, this might be something like a sugar pill. In this study, though, it was decided that it would be unethical to actually put people into a control group, because we know there's a lot of evidence that these things are good for you and that they're good for your brain, that the scientists chose to compare self-guided with structured. We know that people have a much higher chance of making a change when they meet more often, when they're encouraged, when they have direct coaching. So what did they find? So they were measuring what's called a change in global function. So what this is a measurement of how your brain works. How does it think? If you look on the graph on the right, you'll see the orange dots and the kind of the darker blue triangles. The higher the value up on the y-axis, the better memory and thinking would be. So the global cognitive function is a bunch of cognitive tests, things like remembering stories, word lists, sort of measuring how your brain works overall. And the bottom line is you see both the groups went up, both the groups improved, but the people that received the structured intervention actually had a score that was comparable to people with a brain that was 1 to 2 years younger. So this is really exciting that you could actually change the slope. So the slope is the way the line rises, and that you could improve people's cognitive function through lifestyle change. There are a lot more outcomes that were collected in this study. There were brain images, there were sleep measurements, there was biomarkers in the blood, there was some gut health measurements and vascular health, and we expect those results to be reported in December at the CTAD, the Clinical Trials Alzheimer's meeting. So this was really exciting. The prescription that comes out of this, so if you're wondering, how can I do this? What do I need to do? This is the US Pointer Brain Health Recipe. So it involves the 4 different domains. It recommends 30 to 35 minutes of moderate to intense aerobic activity 4 times a week, plus strength and flexibility exercises twice a week. It recommends cognitive exercise, so doing cognitive stimulation. In this case, the Pointer study used a cognitive stimulation brain training computer program. So 3 times a week for 30 minutes is what was recommended. And in terms of nutrition, it's using what's called the MIND diet. And the MIND diet includes dark leafy greens, berries, nuts. I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. And the fourth domain is the health monitoring. So this is regularly checking in on your cardiovascular risk factors, things like your weight, control of diabetes, blood pressure, cholesterol, etc. So those are things your clinician, your primary care clinician can help you with. I wanted to present a little bit more about the MIND diet if you're not familiar with it. It is a combination of the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet. The DASH diet was developed to help people reduce blood pressure. So there's kind of two kinds of rules to this diet. There's things to focus on and there's things to limit. Limit red meat, butter, cheese, sweets, and fried food or fast food, and try to incorporate green leafy vegetables, other vegetables, nuts, berries, beans, whole grains, fish, poultry, and olive oil. So it is a very vegetable forward, healthy diet. And there's cookbooks out there and a lot of recipes online if you're looking for ways to incorporate this into your daily life. So I wanted to switch a little bit and talk about genetics, but also about how genetics relates to lifestyle for potential prevention of dementia. So there is a gene called apolipoprotein E, or we abbreviate it as ApoE, and it plays a role in lipid metabolism and also in brain health. And there's three different versions, or we call them alleles in science. There's E2, E3, and E4, and you receive one copy of the gene from each of your parents. So you have two versions. You can have the same or you could have different. The E2 version conveys a reduced risk of dementia. The E3 is actually neutral, so it doesn't alter your risk of dementia. And E4 increases your risk. So the most risk is when a person has two copies of the E4, so E4, E4. And the least risk comes with two copies of the E2. And what's interesting when looking at the lifestyle benefits is that the E4 carriers, so the people with the highest risk of dementia, actually had the highest benefits from the exercise, diet, and cognitive training. So this is really good news. If you know about your risk, you can do something about it through lifestyle. Okay. I want to switch gears a little bit to that fourth domain. So this is controlling your cardiovascular risk factors, like staying in good health. Another study at the meeting came out with results showing that the drugs commonly used to treat blood pressure, cholesterol, and diabetes actually can protect the brain. People who were taking medications to treat their chronic health conditions had a slower cognitive decline, about equivalent to 3 years younger than those that weren't taking those medication. And it really shows the strong connection of the heart and the brain. So we say what's good for the heart is good for the head. And it really is true. When your heart is healthier, your brain is healthier. Okay, let's switch away from prevention and let's talk about diagnosis and some of the advances that we've seen in that area presented at the meeting. So typically a diagnosis of Alzheimer's and other types of dementia includes tests to rule out other conditions. So typically you visit the doctor, there's a clinical interview to understand your medical history and your chronic conditions. You may have cognitive testing to determine how your brain is working, how well you're able to think and function. You usually get a physical and neurologic exam, and there'll be lab tests, so blood tests that will rule out other things. And sometimes there'll be imaging like a MRI But these are usually to rule out things versus a test that can say yes or no, you have dementia or you have Alzheimer's disease. Recently, there's been new FDA-approved blood tests that actually can be used. They have high sensitivity to detect Alzheimer's. So when you compare the blood test with, let's say, a PET scan for amyloid, this new blood test for phospho-tau 217 is greater than 90% accurate. And it's really exciting that there are new guidelines released on how we could use these clinically. So instead of needing to go for an invasive procedure like potentially a lumbar puncture um, or a PET scan, that there is a blood test that, if it is positive, can indicate that, yes, you do have Alzheimer's disease, and potentially that the new Alzheimer's treatments would be valuable to you after a conversation with your doctor. So the Alzheimer's Association released practice guidelines on how to use um, these phospho-tau 217 blood tests in practice. And this is a really exciting development. They're not yet available from your primary care physician, at least within our systems. I know that new things are evolving over time, and hopefully we'll get to that point in the future. Right now, they're recommended within the specialty care setting. So we heard updates about the new anti-amyloid antibody treatments. I guess they're not completely new. They've been around for a little bit, lecanemab and donanemab. Um, so in the brain of people with Alzheimer's disease, amyloid accumulates. So in the image, you can see those, I guess they're represented by the orange kind of flowery shapes. These new treatments are infusions of antibodies that target the amyloid. The antibodies are represented kind of by those Y-shaped, and what they do is they go in and bind, and then they clear them out of brain. And so these treatments have been shown to effectively reduce brain amyloid um, and to slow cognitive decline. And the data from the new longer time points were presented, showing that they have continued benefit over time. There are some risks of treatment that need to be considered, especially for those that have the ApoE4 gene we talked about. There are higher risks. And so a conversation with your memory care clinician is important. These risks include amyloid-related imaging abnormalities, so they're bleeding and swelling in the brain. Um, and these treatments definitely work better when diagnosed early and can extend the period um, of the good cognition that you have. There are also, in addition to the currently approved medications, some updates about those in the pipeline for treatment. Um, the most data was presented for this new treatment called trontinemab. The different thing about this is, so it's using the same anti-amyloid antibody, so those Y-shaped drugs that are infused. But in this case, it's combined with what they are calling a brain shuttle. And so it helps it get into the brain, and it allows more rapid clearance of the amyloid. And in the recent results that were presented in the phase 1b/2a study, showed that amyloid was completely removed in 91% of people after 28 weeks, which is just about 6 months. And surprisingly, showed a very, very safe, low risk of ARIA compared to the antibodies without the brain shuttle. We don't know yet if it can prevent cognitive decline. Those results are still being analyzed. We do also expect those to be presented in December at that upcoming meeting. They also announced that there are two new phase 3 trials are planned to start before the end of the year to look at this new medication more longer term in a larger population of people. So I wanted to talk a little bit about drug discovery and development. So it takes a long time to develop treatment. So from discovery, the idea, sort of the drug discovery, the idea, to getting approval can be, 10 or more years. The data that we got to see in Toronto was a combination of science that was happening in all of these different areas. Things that were happening in the lab, in the benchtop with cells and brain tissue, things that were happening in the preclinical space, in models, and then different phases of clinical trials. So phase 1 is the early, typically a safety phase, and those are done in a smaller number of patients, maybe 50 or less. Then phase 2, which is in the hundreds, and phase 3 that are in the thousands. And this just gives you the idea of, out of 5 to 10,000 compounds, only 5 might make it to clinical trials, and it might end up with just one FDA-approved drug. And so it takes a lot of work to do drug development, but what's really exciting is that there's a lot of drugs in the pipeline. And now I know you probably can't see all these little words, and I think all of this, the names aren't important, but what I want you to take away from this slide is that in the orange box. So there are 138 drugs that were identified in the recent publication by Cummings about the drug development pipeline for Alzheimer's and dementia. There's more, let's see, 182 clinical trials currently happening. And this is a greater number than in 2024. So there's more work being done in this really important area. You can see the different circles. The outer, if you think of the circle as a target, the outer ring is phase 1, the middle ring is the phase 2, and the inner ring are the phase 3. And then they're kind of organized by color into the different kinds of molecules that they are. Some are targeting the amyloid, like the anti-amyloid antibodies. Others are looking at things like ApoE, neurogenesis, which is regenerative birth of new neurons. Some are focused on tau, but just to give you the wide range of strategies that are being examined and the large number of trials that are in progress. Some are disease-targeted biologics, and that means that they're targeting, I guess, a disease-specific molecule. Others are more cognitive enhancers or symptom management. I want to just share a little more about the distribution of these, and there's no way I could present the results of all of these, but just to give you the wide idea of what's out there. I have just a few more slides, and then we can break for some questions. So this is just another way to look at the amount of trials that are out there. The green ones are phase 1, the blue are phase 2, and the yellow are phase 3. And then you can see the different targeted. Some newer drugs are targeting what's called the gut-brain axis. We talked about what's good for the heart is good for the brain. We now know that the microbiome in the gut also is related to brain health. There's some growth factors and hormones that are being investigated, and a large amount of molecules around inflammation, and looking for anti-inflammatory effects to really reduce that in the brain can be beneficial, in addition to the amyloid we talked about, and the tau, which is also accumulates in the brain of patients with Alzheimer's disease. So the bottom line is that there's more hope than ever, that research is rapidly advancing. There's many innovations for prevention and diagnosis and treatment, and I'm just able to share a few of those with you today. Thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to answer questions if you would put them in the chat.
Thank you, Dr. Hanson, for such an informational presentation. It's a lot of information to take in and process. I have a follow-up question for you. Out of the US pointer study for the lifestyle changes, which of those prescription lifestyle activities do you think is most important?
Oh, that's a really good question. And I'd say all of them, but there was the data isn't completely analyzed, but they did look at adherence. Adherence is how much someone complied with the suggestions. And so the compliance to the physical activity and the diet were a lot higher than the adherence to the cognitive stimulation. And so I would say the diet and exercise um, would be the areas to focus on. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for providing us with your feedback. That's helpful. So get up and moving a little bit more and or a lot more, and improving and changing our diet would have a great impact. That's wonderful to know. We received another wonderful question. What can we do now to help our relatives who may be resistant to change due to their dementia?
Ooh, that's a good question for our social worker and our care coordination team versus me as a scientist. Um, I think that always being positive and and thinking of who you are as a caregiver in the moment um, can be very helpful. Oftentimes, we might expect our loved ones to be the way they used to be, allowing them to be who they are and being flexible, yet presenting boundaries, trying to find new and fun ways to encourage different activities, um, and just being persistent and patient would be my advice. I don't know if we have Anna, if you're on the call, if you have anything you'd like to add, maybe we can figure out how to unmute you. Otherwise, you can enter that in the chat. So there's a question in the chat. Are senior facilities getting this information to improve their programming and encourage the actions suggested? That's a great point. So what's really important with science and when we have the best outcome is when the research can be translated into practice. And there is, in fact, an implementation project happening by the US Pointer team. So they are running some implementation sites really in how to get this out into the community. I don't believe they're focusing on living facilities, but I think community organizations. But that's something that we're talking about here at the Health Partners Center for Memory and Aging is how can we disseminate these brain health suggestions to help promote brain health and prevent dementia. So that's really an important point. Thank you. Let's see. There's a question. I see some medications on the ongoing trials list that I think are approved for other indications. Is there interesting research around those for use with dementia that's occurred off-label to stand out as more interesting? So really good point. There is a trend in the field of using medications that are already approved for other things would be a much shorter approval pathway. When you think about this, the graph of the science, I showed that at least 10 years it takes. If you start with a molecule treatment that's approved for something else, often that pathway can be shorter. I don't have any updates today on use of those drugs, but just to say that is an important strategy. Our research group has looked at the use of insulin and deferoxamine, which are two FDA-approved drugs, though we administer them intranasally versus systemically. And so we have to go through a bit longer approval process. But those are two I'm really interested in our group has worked on. So there's a question, why are brain memory supplements allowed to be marketed in the media, like Prevagen, for example? Um, so supplements and vitamins are not regulated in the same way by the FDA. And so there's a lot less regulation and they can make certain kinds of claims. There are some small research study that have been done with vitamins. Interestingly, I don't know if you've noticed that the vitamin, the silver, I think it's Centrum, has had some commercials about supporting brain health because the vitamins were actually used as a control group in a study, and it was actually shown in an analysis of a very small number of people that the people taking those vitamins had better brain health. But that's the reason why supplements are treated differently than medications. And Anna commented, lately we hear more the word preventative and normally it's more common to reduce the risk of dementia in general. And that makes sense. Targeting cardiovascular health can likely help more with vascular dementia for prevention. Great questions. One of the things that I didn't talk about today, but that we do at our research center here is we are looking at something that's not a medication. We're looking at transcranial magnetic stimulation for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease to improve cognition. It is a magnetic field that actually can excite your brain cells and increase or decrease the firing in certain very specific regions of the brain. And we are currently conducting a clinical trial in that space, hoping to do a larger trial in the future to look at whether this non-invasive brain stimulation can be helpful for Alzheimer's disease. And since we don't have any other questions, I'll just comment one area that I didn't include because again, it just gets to be an overwhelming amount of information is there's a lot of research on how we can best support care partners of people living with Alzheimer's and related dementia. Caregiving can be stressful and stress can cause chronic inflammation and it can alter your health and lead to um, mental health symptoms like depression, anxiety. So there's a number of different interventions. Our group has looked at something called mindfulness-based dementia care, which is mindfulness-based stress reduction in the context of caregiving. So how to be mindful through the act of caregiving. And we've seen really exciting preliminary data. We didn't present it this year, it was a year ago, in 130 caregivers that went through the program. When we looked at their symptoms before and after and in follow-up, 12-week follow-up, we did find that depressive symptoms were lower and that the odds of having depression was significantly lower in those people after they had gone through the program. When we currently do offer that program, it's an online virtual program if you're interested. And we usually advertise that in our newsletter, and it's also on our NeuroWell website if you'd like more information on how you might sign up to participate in that. It's a weekly 2-hour virtual class, and then a 4-hour, so a half-day retreat. And its focuses on how to be present in the here and now, and how to interact with your loved one with dementia, in the moment, and to find joy in every day, and how to regulate stress, and a lot of coping and resilience strategies, as well as self-compassion.